Mark and Sarah were the kind of couple people noticed, not because they were loud or flashy, but because they exuded the quiet, magnetic energy of two people who were completely comfortable with each other. It was July 2001, Death Valley National Park. They had been on the road for a week, a dusty road trip through the Southwest. Cameras were packed, guidebooks were covered with circles and stars, little notes were scrawled in the margins. Must see this. Ask a ranger about that. They pulled up at the Furnace Creek Visitor Center just after noon. The surveillance footage, later examined second by second, shows Sarah adjusting her ponytail and Mark leaning over the counter, a map spread out between them. They bought 2 bottles of water, a stack of postcards, a thin booklet about Death Valley hiking trails. Mark joked with the ranger about sneaking away for one more adventure before heading home to San Diego. Sarah smiled, half annoyed, half amused. They were last seen walking toward their white SUV. A rental car, the sun glaring off the windshield, the heat already rising in waves from the asphalt. The ranger standing outside waved casually. They waved back. That was it. They were never seen again. In the years that followed, that last moment became the stuff of Death Valley legend. A snapshot of 2 young hikers about to plunge into a story no one could explain. Sarah's mother later recalled a voicemail. "Hey, just checking. We're going for a quick hike before we leave. Love you." Mark's brother recalled a text message. "Damn, this place is wild. Never seen anything like it. Normal, every day." And then they were gone. There was no drama, no arguments, no sudden storms, no signposts to foretell what was to come. Just a pair of lovers chasing one more memory in the desert, just as so many others had done before them. But in Death Valley, one last walk can turn into something else entirely. Something not on the maps. Something the guidebooks fail to warn you about. Something that waits just beyond the edge of where you think is safe. By the time anyone realized Mark and Sarah were missing, the desert had already begun its work. The temperature was rising fast. July in Death Valley isn't just hot, it's record-breaking, bone-searing, breath-stealing heat. That week, the forecast was alarming, even by desert standards. 122 degrees at Furnace Creek, 126 near Badwater Basin. The asphalt softened beneath your tires. The air was so dry it sucked the moisture right out of your skin. Rangers posted warnings at every station. Avoid hiking. Carry extra water. Stay close to main roads. Tourists passed the signs, pausing only briefly to take photos. For fun, for praise. Most were cautious, some were not. On July 7th, around 3 p.m., a park ranger driving along Warm Springs Road saw a white SUV parked on the side of the road. It was a fleeting glimpse, but later she remembered. 2 people outside, crouched by the open trunk, a map spread out, Mark's baseball cap covering her face, Sarah tying her hiking boots. No one thought much of it. Couples stop all the time to check directions, take photos, cool off before continuing on. By late afternoon, the heat was unkind. Temperatures hovered around 100 degrees Fahrenheit after sunset. The desert shimmered gold and purple, a beauty that masked danger. Back at the information center, the radios were buzzing with minor announcements, routine patrols, overheating cars, tourists cutting their trips short. No one knew that Mark and Sarah were already hours away from where they were supposed to be. The next morning, when they failed to check out of a motel in Betty, Nevada, the owner assumed they had left early. When Sarah's mother didn't get the promised "we're on the road again" call, she wondered if they had cell service. It would be another 24 hours before anyone began to worry. By then, the sun had risen and set twice, and the temperatures had risen even higher. Death Valley doesn't operate by time. There, the hours stretch, the minutes melt away, and when the desert decides to close its hand over you, the hours become a cruel joke. The last confirmed sighting of the couple had been just another day in the park. But by the time rangers checked that same stretch of Warm Springs Road, The SUV was gone, and so were they. There was a small, leather-bound notebook worn at the edges. When it was eventually found, wedged between the passenger seat and the center console, the ink had smudged at the corners, but most of the words were still there, enough to tell a story no one expected. Mark had kept notes the entire trip. Short, pithy observations, trails they liked, places they ate, funny comments Sarah made while driving. But there was something else amid the mundane. Several entries before the last date read, "Local at gas station said something about a hidden cave near Warm Springs. Old mining site, worth checking out. Sounds cool. Later. Found on old map. Barely marked, not far from where we set up camp. Just a quick glance. Nothing special." The handwriting on the last page changes, becoming rushed, sloppy. Sarah thinks it's too hot for this. She's probably right, but we're here. Gonna check the pass, see if we can find a cave. Be back before sundown. Locals interviewed after the couple's disappearance told versions of the same story. Yes, there were old stories about an abandoned mine somewhere near Warm Springs Canyon, one that never showed up on tourist maps. Most locals avoided it, not out of superstition, but because it was stupid to go into a place that could swallow you up. Mark didn't know that, or maybe he did, but adventure had blurred the edges. The idea of finding something secret, something not in the guidebooks, had gotten under his skin. Sarah, according to the records, was more cautious. But sometimes love is a compromise. Eventually they passed the hiking trail markers, dropped into a maze of gullies and dry riverbeds, following an old dirt road barely visible under the sand. It wasn't far, they thought, just over the ridge, just around the next bend. The desert doesn't care what you plan. It only cares about what you bring in and what you leave behind. A week later, a park ranger flying the area looking for it spotted it from the air. A white shimmer against the bone sand color, far from any mapped road, deep in Anvil Canyon. The SUV was half buried in drift sand. One rear tire was almost completely buried. The fronts were buried up to the axles. From the air, it looked like it had been parked, not wrecked. Calmly, deliberately. But on the ground, the details painted a more disturbing picture. The doors were locked, the keys were inside, the windows were up. There were no tracks leading away, just faint disturbances in the sand that the wind had mostly erased. Inside the car was a time capsule, 2 empty bottles of water, a crumpled map with a trembling X, a guidebook folded on the long-distance section, a phone with no signal, and Mark's leather notebook. Sarah's sunglasses were in the cup holder, one temple broken. There was no sign of a struggle, no sign of being forced out, no obvious mechanical failure. There was still gas in the tank. The engine, upon inspection, started without a problem. It was as if they had parked, stepped out for a moment, and simply never returned. The rangers combed the area, following the grid lines, scanning with drones, calling their names into the hot silence. Nothing. No clothes. No gear. No tracks. Just the car, as still and silent as a grave. People began to whisper. Maybe they were lost. Too far gone. Maybe they had fallen into one of the narrow side canyons. Maybe the heat had led them to make a fatal mistake. But some wondered about the cave Mark had written about. If it had been there, if they had found it, if it had become their tomb. By nightfall, the sand had already begun its slow return, softening the edges, attracting tire tracks. In Death Valley, even the searchers knew. The desert gave up its secrets only when it wanted to, and sometimes never. The search began under a sky so vast it felt like it could swallow you whole. By the time the Rangers officially launched the operation, Mark and Sarah had been missing for more than 5 days. That's how things happen here. People allow delays, missed calls, maybe a last-minute change of plans until they return. Until the motel owner notices an empty room, until the rental car company calls asking why their car hasn't been returned. The SUV became ground zero. From there, teams fanned out. Rangers from Death Valley, volunteer search and rescuers from Inyo County, even helicopters sent from the China Lake base. Horses were brought in to cover the ground the trucks couldn't reach. They combed canyons and ridges, creeks and gullies, screaming their names into the searing void. But it felt like Mark and Sarah had been erased from the face of the earth. No tracks, no discarded gear, no scraps of clothing caught on rocks. The sand was an accomplice. Every windblow erased the tracks. Helicopter crews scanned for movement, heat signatures. Nothing. Searchers worked from dawn to dusk. The days were relentless, 110 degrees Fahrenheit, sometimes hotter. The kind of heat that sucked the sweat from your body before you even realized you were thirsty. Radios crackled, water bottles emptied. They checked old mine shafts, gullies near Anvil Canyon, the trailhead to Warm Springs. Someone remembered a hiker's report years ago of a cave collapsed near a side canyon. They marked it. They searched it. Nothing. With each passing hour, hope faded further. The Rangers knew the math. Out here, without water, survival time was measured in hours, not days. But they searched anyway because sometimes you do it for your families. Sometimes you do it because you're stubborn. And sometimes, deep down, you believe the desert can bring someone back if you search hard enough. On the 7th day, Mark's sister, Emily, appeared on local television. She sat just under the studio lights, her hair pulled back into a nervous ponytail, her hands twisting a napkin in her lap. Her voice was even, but her eyes were red from crying, exhausted. "We just want them home," she said quietly. Mark and Sarah were seasoned hikers. This wasn't recklessness. This wasn't just wandering. She talked about her brother, his love of history, the old books he collected, the maps, always the maps. He was fascinated by old mining routes, she said, her voice cracking slightly. He studied these old papers he found online, talked about hidden shafts, abandoned tunnels. He wanted to see places people had forgotten. The public seized on the detail, a hidden cave, a lost mine. It brought the message boards alive, the amateur detective threads, the campfire stories. The prospectors took notice too. They dug up old surveys, mining records, ranger reports from decades ago. Some of the veterans muttered under their breath about places best left alone, places that weren't on any official map, places the desert had claimed long ago. Emily's call went out. The camera crews arrived. Photos of the couple appeared on missing persons posters, on websites, in the corners of the evening news. Mark grinning under a baseball cap, Sarah laughing behind big sunglasses, and all over the country, people watched and wondered and said the same thing to themselves. How could a couple just disappear? But in Death Valley, it's easier than you might think. Theories began to form quickly. At the coffee shops around Furnace Creek, at the gas stations along the highway, on the dusty porches where locals watched the endless sun beat down, everyone had a theory. Everyone had a hunch. They were in trouble. One bartender told a reporter, shaking his head grimly, "There are drifters, drug dealers, people who use these back canyons to transport things they don't want seen." Others whispered of violent death, of darker implications. What if someone was waiting? A hitchhiker they picked up, a stranger at a gas station, a wrong turn into the arms of someone who knew the desert better than they did. And then there were the old-timers, shaking their heads at it all. "There's no mystery," they said, "just heat and hubris. It happens every few years. City people come here thinking they're stronger than the desert. But the desert wins rumors and speculation spread like wildfire. Themes emerged overnight. People scoured satellite images, old mountain maps, Reddit posts, conspiracy blogs. The area that drew particular attention was the China Lake Naval Weapons Center, a restricted military zone bordering the park. What if they'd stumbled on something they weren't supposed to see? What if they'd been silenced? For the families, it was agony. Emily stopped reading the comments after a few days. Sarah's parents didn't go online at all, but searchers heard the noise, and some wondered late at night if they were missing something. Everyone agreed on one thing: people don't just disappear. Not completely. But Death Valley has always been a place where things slip away. Water, time, trails, memories. Sometimes people too. Soon, someone spoke the words, Death Valley Germans. In 1996, a family of 4 from Dresden, 2 adults, 2 children, disappeared in almost exactly the same place in the desert. They were last seen driving a green Plymouth minivan, smiling for pictures at tourist sites, buying maps in Furnace Creek. They never returned home. Their abandoned van was found months later deep in Anvil Canyon, its tires shredded, stuck in the sand. For 13 years, no one knew what had happened until a pair of tourists, following old clues, found the family's remains scattered across a remote hillside. The comparisons were inevitable now. The searchers knew it, the locals knew it, so did Emily, quietly reading the old reports in her motel room at night, circling dates and names. Both cases had started with a wrong turn. Both had curious, adventurous travelers. Both had attracted search parties, helicopters, and days of hard work in the desert, only to find nothing. And both had been drawn into the strange history of Death Valley, a place where men chase legends and sometimes become them. A veteran of the 1996 case had spoken out. Some had approached rangers, others had given interviews, offering cautious advice. Don't assume they went east just because the car was facing that way. Check the creeks. Check the south. Check places that aren't on the maps. One name kept coming up. Tom Mahood, the man who had cracked the German family case in 2009. People wondered if he would come back. Would he see something everyone else had missed? But beneath all the speculation, there was something simpler, something colder. The desert doesn't change. People change. People forget. People make the same mistakes. And the desert just waits. The rumor had been around for years, maybe longer than anyone remembered. It was a prospector named Alan "Red" McKinley who first mentioned it to the rangers, his voice quiet, like he was making a confession. Red had been mining Death Valley for decades, chasing the last vestiges of the gold rush, walking trails most people didn't even know existed. There's a cave there, he told them, squinting into the sun. Somewhere near Anvil Canyon, an old mining spot, I think. Sand had covered most of the entrance from one of the big winds years ago, but it's there. The rangers had heard stories like this before. Everyone had a lost cave, a buried shaft, a hidden tunnel. Sometimes it was old miners who told the tale. Sometimes it was tourists. Sometimes it was just desert dreamers sitting at a bar after too many beers. But Red was different. He wasn't telling the story for attention. If anything, he seemed hesitant, restless. Never been in there myself, he admitted. Couldn't even find the entrance. But I met a guy years ago, said he came across it, barely enough room to squeeze through, just a crack in the rock, mostly sand. Said it widened inside more than you'd expect. Said there were signs someone had been in there, left in a hurry. Rangers noted it, wrote it down, let it gather dust, like so many other local legends. But after Mark and Sarah disappeared, Red's words came back with more force, more weight. Search parties combed Anvil Canyon, laid out grids, scanned the walls with drones and climbers, but the desert held its secrets. No cave appeared, no hidden entrance found. Just the same cracked rock, the same dry gullies, the same brutal stretches of nothingness. But for those who knew the area, the question remained. What if Mark went looking? What if they found it? And what if they never came back out? 8 years after Mark and Sarah disappeared, a hiker named Dave Lanning stopped at Bath Valley to rest. Dave wasn't looking for anything in particular, just a place to pitch a tent, fill his water bottles, and watch the stars scatter across the sky like silver dice. but not far from an old mining concession, tucked away in a rusty metal box, half buried in rocks. He found something. A map. It was tattered, the edges curled, the ink faded by sun and time, the kind someone might have scribbled in a field, not an official print. Roads were scrawled, some crossed out, side canyons marked with tiny notes. Narrow pass, steep climb, beware of loose rocks, and, near Anvil Canyon, a shaky X. At first, Dave thought it was just someone's old hiking plan, but the handwriting was neat, almost obsessive. There were notes in the margins, possible shaft, caveat, and the faintest need to check on next trip. He passed it on to the rangers, who forwarded it to the search and rescue archives. Communication was not immediate. The handwriting did not match Mark's, and there was no name or date. But to those who remembered the couple, who remembered Mark's fascination with old mines and hidden places, it was like a whisper from the past. Could this be what he was looking for? The rangers argued quietly behind closed doors. Should they resume the search? Should they send teams back to the place marked on the map? Or was this just another dead end in a desert full of them? For now, the map sat in a drawer, sealed in a plastic bag, waiting for someone to follow the X. The case had gone cold, folded like so many others, just names on a report, photos on a bulletin board, a mystery that the desert had quietly swallowed. But the map changed that. When the tattered paper showed up in Bath Valley, the tone behind closed doors had changed. Officially, the case was still considered inactive. No public announcements had been made. But inside ranger stations and at search and rescue meetings, interest was rekindled. The X marked an area that few had thoroughly searched, a remote stretch of land near Anvil Canyon, bordered by old mining concessions and cut off by dunes and dry riverbeds. Back in 2001, most searches had been along known trails, likely routes. But this was out of the pattern. A small team was assembled. No press, no resurrected missing person posters, no cameras looming over trailheads. Just a few seasoned searchers, a couple of rangers with old case files still dog-eared on their desks, and a satellite phone. They studied topographical maps, comparing them to the handwritten version. And the more they looked, the more one thing became apparent. If Mark and Sarah were following this line, they wouldn't be wandering aimlessly. They were trying to get to something. A trunk, a cave, an entrance, something no one else had marked. A new search began in the cool of dawn. Boots crunched on brittle rock. The sun hadn't yet risen high enough to turn the world into an oven. The air was still heavy with the silence that could only be found in places far from roads, far from help. They worked methodically, grid by grid, moving slowly, calling names into the silence. Radios crackled softly as they reported. Drones swooped overhead, over the dunes, their cameras scanning the rippling sand, searching for anything unusual. Nothing. But no one was backing down. Not yet. Because in Death Valley, sometimes you only get one chance. And this time, they weren't alone. When word reached Tom Mahood, he didn't hesitate to gather his gear. Tom was no stranger to this kind of search. In 2009, it was his obsessive research and unstructured tenacity that helped solve the Death Valley Germans' case, when the scattered remains of a family the desert had kept secret for more than a decade were found. He wasn't a professional detective. He wasn't in law enforcement. He was someone else, someone who couldn't let go. By the time he reached the edge of Anvil Gorge, the dunes were shimmering in the heat. He downloaded the old GPS data, compared it to a new hand-drawn map, overlaid it with satellite images on his laptop. A pattern emerged. Thread-thin, narrow gullies that led to a point just beyond the main 2001 search zones. That's where they were supposed to go, Tom told the team, his voice steady and confident. If they were looking for water or shade or whatever they thought was there, he'd lead them into the dunes. GPS clipped to his belt, eyes scanning not just the ground, but the shape of the landscape, how it curved, where it dropped, where it hinted at something hidden. This was a place few had been before. The sand was softer here, deeper, folded in waves. Boots sank a half-inch with every step. Heat pulsed off the ground in slow, dizzying waves. Hours passed. Then, toward dusk, the first glimpse of something unnatural, a scrap of cloth, faded and half-melted into the earth. Nearby, a slight depression, as if the earth had once sunk and then slowly filled in. Tom crouched, ran his hand over the sand. "Here," he said quietly. No one spoke. No one moved. Because sometimes the desert doesn't erase everything. Sometimes it leaves just enough for someone stubborn enough or hunted enough to find it. It was almost mist. It was late afternoon, the light low, bathing everything in gold, turning the dunes into a shimmering sea. Most of the team had already turned back to check gear, take sips of water, shade their eyes from the sun. But Tom lingered, scanning the ground, watching for subtle changes in color, places where the sand wasn't quite right. Then he saw it, a faint glimmer, no bigger than a coin, half swallowed by the earth. He sat down carefully, his heart beating steadily, his fingers brushing away the tiny, sun-dried grains. There, among the pebbles and dead plants, was a thin metal hoop, a bracelet. He picked it up carefully, shook the sand off, turned it over in his hand. At the bottom, barely visible, making him catch his breath, was engraved a single letter. "Sarah," Tom called softly, his voice low but piercing the silence like thunder. The team gathered, boots crunching in a wide circle, faces tense. It was a delicate, feminine piece of jewelry, the kind worn every day without thinking, a piece of skin and habit. They packed it, marked a GPS location, broadcast it. But what most attracted Tom was not the jewelry itself. It was where it lay. The sand here seemed unusually soft, slightly sagging, as if the earth had once moved or been moved. A barely noticeable depression unless you looked closely, unless you had walked too many miles through places that didn't want to be seen. He knelt down, pressed his palm lightly into the earth. It gave just enough to know that something below had once been empty, and perhaps still was. The next morning they worked slowly, methodically. No hurry, no shovels, just gloved hands brushing away sand, exploring the earth, mapping the thin skin of the earth. The depression grew wider as they explored, a shallow sinkhole, perhaps 6 feet in diameter, deep enough to catch the wind, to hold the bracelet, to whisper a story no one wanted to hear. Tom lay on the ground, his ear to the surface, tapping his knuckles softly. The sound came back, a strange, muffled, hollow echo like a drum taut with time and dust. "It's a cave-in," he muttered, more to himself than to the others. "An old mine, maybe, or a cave." Every step along the edge of the rim caused the earth to shift slightly, just enough to remind them that this place had been waiting a long time to be found. The team marked out a perimeter, consulted maps, traced old fault lines no longer visible to the eye. They brought out a narrow probe, carefully lowering it into the earth. He fell further than expected, cutting through layers of sand, hitting air. There was a cavity. They set up ropes, cleared gear, spoke softly. The desert around them held its breath. By dusk, the probe was sending back clear data. Below them, 10 feet or so deep, was a hollow space, larger than anyone had wanted to guess, framed by rock, held together only by stubborn gravity. Tom stood at the edge, staring at the cracked earth, his face white under his tan. They weren't just lost. They'd been here all along. They worked as if the earth might crumble. No heavy equipment, no hasty shovels, just gloved hands, small trowels, brushes meant for archaeology, not salvage. Every grain of sand lifted was measured, bagged, logged. The desert watched, The sun rose fiercely each morning, beat down on their backs, then sank a crimson bruise below the horizon. But they worked on. Layer after layer of sand they peeled away, revealing the mouth of something ancient, the edge of a passage long hidden by drift and rockfall. It was little at first, a narrow crack, the frame of a reinforced shaft of some forgotten mine. The wooden beams were rotted but still held their shape. Bits of rusty wire, old nails, crumbling stone, and the faint but distinct smell of something that had once been alive. Tom often walked away, arms folded, eyes narrowed, not in suspicion, but in sorrow. "There it is," he muttered more than once. The deeper they went, the more they saw how the earth had swallowed it whole. A landslide, perhaps, or the slow collapse of the ceiling over the years. The sand was doing its work, carried grain by the hot wind, filling every crack, burying every footprint, smoothing it all into oblivion. At the threshold, they braced the earth with wooden struts, measuring the stability, testing each step. Inside, the air was cool, unnaturally cool, the kind of cold that lingers in places where the sun has not shone for decades. No one said what they thought, but it hung in the air like a heavy weight. This was not just a cave, it was a tomb. They broke through just after dusk on the third day. A soft collapse. The sand shifted inward with a sigh. Not a roar, enough to open a passage, wide enough for light, wide enough for a man. Tom led the way, carefully, slowly. His knees scraped against the rocks. The beam of the flashlight cut a narrow path through the darkness. The air inside was bone dry and smelled of dust and old stone and the faintest of humanity. The beam caught something pale ahead. Cloth, skin. They were there. Two figures, close together, huddled together. Mark's arm was around Sarah, or what was left of them. Their clothes clung where the desert would allow. Their skin was parched to leather in the dry cold, their hair brittle, their faces sunken but dim. The remains of their packs lay nearby, a crumpled bottle of water, the charred casing of a flashlight, a notebook, warped but whole. The pages were curled and yellowed. The last pages told the rest. The roof sagged, trying to wait it out. "Love you, Mom. Love you, Emily," holding Sarah's hand. Outside, the search party waited, heads down, breaths held. When Tom emerged, he didn't have to say anything. His face said it all. The desert had preserved them, but not erased them, not entirely. Confirmation came quickly. In a small lab humming outside the park, under fluorescent lights too harsh and too clean for the grief they worked alongside, forensics did its work. The dental records came first. Fillings on molars, patterns on crowns, an old fracture in Sarah's incisor from a bike accident years ago. A match. Then DNA. Hair samples, bone scrapings, cross-checked with samples taken from relatives, flown in overnight. Another match. Mark and Sarah had been missing for 8 years, hidden underground, nestled in the desert like a dried flower. All their searching and wandering had ended in this quiet, collapsed place. For the families, the news came on the phone. The kind of call you both dread and crave after so long in limbo. Emily cried when the sheriff called. Sarah's mother hung up mid-explanation and just sat in the kitchen, staring out the dark window, unable to move. For the Rangers, it was a quiet moment, hard but inevitable. Cases don't stay open forever. Files need to be closed. But for Tom, standing at the edge of the site as the last of the samples were packed, it felt different. It felt personal. He watched as the technicians labeled each bag, sealed each envelope, and knew that these weren't just remains. These were people. People who trusted the map, who trusted the sky, who trusted each other, and somewhere along the way, the desert had taken them. Inside the cave, history waited. The search party worked carefully, lifting each item as if it might crumble into memory. There was a water bottle, its plastic, sun-dried teeth marks barely visible along the lid. A flashlight that had failed. Its housing had cracked. The switch had jammed sideways. A small camera had melted slightly at the edge where heat had leaked. Its battery had turned to powder. A notebook. Mark's handwriting was shaking near the end. The ink was smeared where his thumb had pressed too hard. His words crowded the margins as the pages ended. They were taking cover. They were waiting. No sign of panic. No scrambling at the walls. No desperate scratching at the rocks. Just the two of them together, conserving water, waiting to be rescued, holding out longer than anyone had a right to. The last pages hit the hardest. We hear the wind outside, maybe soon, calmly, together. Love you. Love you. Love you. Outside, the sand moved softly in the wind, light as breath, and the desert that had held its secret for so long was finally, almost gently, letting go. The notebook was the last thing they pulled out. It was wedged under a small rock near where the bodies were found, as if Mark had placed it carefully, or perhaps it had slipped from his hand in his final hours. The cover was stiff with age, the corners softened by moisture. But when the forensic team carefully opened it, the pages inside were intact. The early entries had been practical: distances, temperatures, rough sketches of the terrain, notes on the map they were following. Little things intended as future reminders to themselves, or perhaps to Sarah, or perhaps just the habit of a man who liked to leave a trail of his thoughts. But toward the end, the tone had changed. The writing had become looser, uneven. The words crowded the lines, rushed, as if time itself had begun to disintegrate. Avalanche. The sand had collapsed. I'll check the exit again in the morning. Rations. All right, Sarah's asleep. We must remain calm, waiting for darkness. The air is cooler. Maybe we can dig. And then, be strong, Sarah. Be strong, Sarah. Be strong, Sarah. The last page was nothing more than her name, written over and over again. The ink was pressed so hard it cut through the paper, a desperate echo of someone holding on, someone trying to believe that they could still live until morning. When the notebook was shown to Emily, she closed it quietly after reading only a few pages. She didn't need to see anymore. She already knew who her brother was. She already knew how he would face the darkness. The search team had placed the notebook as evidence, but no one spoke of it as evidence. They spoke of her as a voice. And he said only this: we tried. We waited. We held together. The analysis came back with brutal clarity. The geologists surveyed the site, tracking the cracks, studying the fallen rock. It had not been a sudden catastrophe, not something you could hear, run from, duck at the last second. It had been slow, almost invisible. The entrance had been narrowing for years, wind and sand making it tighter. When Mark and Sarah slipped inside, they had passed through a throat of earth already on the brink of collapse. Soon after they entered, perhaps hours, perhaps minutes, the last support gave way. The roof of soft rock, heavy with sand, sank inward. Not enough to slam shut, enough to seal. The depression was barely noticeable on the surface. To anyone on the outside, it looked like another subsidence, another drift, but inside, it meant everything. The cavity they were trapped in had held longer than it should have. The dry air had preserved their bodies, their belongings, their last hours. But it was sealed. They had tried. The tracks were faint, but they had scraped the rocks, dug with their hands, measured the effort, not the wild panic. They had saved water, marked the days. They had written notes, perhaps hoping a rescuer would find them, perhaps just to keep their sanity, but they could not get out. Analysis confirmed what no one wanted to say out loud. They had been alive for days, maybe longer, long enough to wait for darkness, to whisper consolation, to still believe that someone would come. They weren't foolish or reckless or lost, after all. They were unlucky. Unlucky in an unforgiving desert. The questions came fast as the news spread. Not just how they died or why they were there, but the most poignant of all. Could they have been saved? Stories soon surfaced. A couple of hikers passing through Anvil Gulch in the spring of 2002 left a note in a visitor's log at Furnace Creek. Something about hearing faint voices. It was written off at the time. "We were near some old mining routes late in the afternoon," one of them recalled in old correspondence found by reporters. "Heard something on the wind, a high-pitched sound. Could have been a woman, could have just been the sound of gusts through the rocks. You hear things up there. You always hear things up there." Another hiker, a lone camper, recalled camping near Booth Valley that same season and noting in his diary a strange echo at sunset, as if someone were calling faintly from far away. He thought it was another camper, or perhaps just his own nerves. None of it had seemed worth mentioning at the time, but now it clung to the edge of every conversation like smoke. Were Mark and Sarah alive just below the surface, waiting, hoping, their cries coming through a crack in the earth, carried on the desert wind, touching the ears of those who stopped and listened, then moved on? Rangers cautioned against jumping to conclusions. The distances, the acoustics out there, it's easy to imagine things, one said. But off the record, some wondered. And for families, it was the hardest thought of all. Not only that they were lost, but that maybe, just maybe, someone had almost found them. The press releases went out quietly, without platforms or cameras. Emily's statement was brief. She thanked the searchers, especially Tom, using his first name. She thanked the rangers, the forensics team, the volunteers, and then, in the last line, she wrote, "We always believed they were together," and they were. Sarah's parents issued a letter through their pastor, handwritten, sometimes shaky. They spoke of their daughter's love of adventure, her laughter, the way she could turn any small thing, a road trip, a roadside diner, a quiet stroll, into something magical. "We never stopped waiting," they wrote. "Now we know where she is." Closure was a strange word, and it sat heavy on the lips of those left behind. Some called it relief. Some called it heartache. For 8 years, they had lived in the void of the unknown, filling it with hope or anger or silence. Now that space was filled not with answers, but with finality, and that was its own kind of grief. In Death Valley the next morning, as always, the sun rose over the dunes, golden and vast and indifferent. The same place that had taken Mark and Sarah, the same place that had hidden them for so long, now watched their family step into the slow, painful light of knowledge. The silence did not last. Within days, the news had spread beyond the desert. First local stations, then national headlines, then ripples across the online spaces where missing persons cases live in a strange, dark corner of the internet. Couple found after 8 years in Death Valley. Mark and Sarah, lost adventurers or something more. The mystery of the cave collapse. Could they have been saved? Reporters flooded the park. They filmed near Anvil Gorge, though rangers had pushed them away from the site itself. Helicopters hovered overhead for long shots of shimmering dunes, cracked earth, the void that swallowed 2 lives whole. Theories flared up again, almost instantly. Was it really an accident? Some anchors raised questions on air. Why didn't they turn back? Why did they take a dangerous, unmapped route? Were they chasing something or running from something? Speculation swirled online. Hidden treasure, a secret military test, a survivalist stunt gone wrong. And there were darker corners, whispers that perhaps they had been lured. Maybe they had met someone there. Maybe the collapse hadn't been entirely natural. For the searchers, for the families, it had been excruciating. Emily declined to be interviewed. Sarah's parents stopped returning calls. Tom Mahood, whose quiet persistence had finally led to the discovery, issued a short, measured statement. "There is no conspiracy here. Just two people who took a wrong turn in a place that punishes wrong turns. Let's not make their story into anything less or more than it was. But even he knew that stories like these don't just disappear, especially when there's an X in the center of the map. Another week passed before a man stepped forward. His name was Paul Crenshaw, a retired geologist, thin and tanned, his hands still bearing the rough marks of field work. He had left the map in an old metal box near Booth Valley, which Dave Lanning had found and given to the rangers. Paul hadn't drawn the X lightly. For years, he had crisscrossed the area, tracking down old mining reports, following rumors of shafts and collapsed tunnels. He had seen the subsidence near Anvil Gulch, noted the way the earth behaved, the strange way the sand behaved. "I was always going to report this," he told reporters quietly, his eyes downcast. "But I told myself no one would be there." When the map surfaced, when the search resumed, Paul felt his stomach twist. He knew deep down, what he had known for years, that there was something wrong there. "I just thought it was an old mine," he said. "I didn't think there were people in there." He paused, his voice shaking slightly. "I wish I could say something." The media seized on his regret, painting him as almost a hero or almost a villain, depending on the headline. But those close to the case understood. Paul was no villain. He was just another man haunted by the desert, and he learned too late the price of silence. The cave, it turned out, had a name. Historians traced it to a mining claim filed in 1931. The Beckett Mine, part of a short-lived gold operation that barely lasted 2 seasons before it failed due to heat, expense, and frustration. The records survived in crumbling county records, yellowed sheets of purchase order lists, a handful of faded payroll records, and one thin line in an old ledger. Operations ceased due to instability. It was never going to be found again. Locals remembered bits and pieces. An old man remembered his grandfather talking about a hole you shouldn't go near. A mapmaker had put the place on a topographical map in the 1970s but left the mark blank, deemed unimportant. Collapsed. By the time Mark and Sarah arrived in 2001, the place was little more than a dent in the landscape, a whisper in the rocks, a ghost of its former purpose long since erased by the sand. The more the historians dug, the clearer the picture became. The mine had not been repaired for nearly a century. The wooden supports found near the collapse had rotted away, no more capable of supporting weight than dry twigs. The sand, ever restless, drifted, shifted, settled. The desert cares nothing for history, but it still holds it. It holds stories in its bones until some pair of travelers, young and adventurous, stumbles upon them, unaware that the ground beneath their feet is not just a desert, but a cemetery. And sometimes decades pass before anyone remembers. Ranger Bill Harmon has worked in Death Valley for 30 years. When reporters asked him for comment, they expected facts, descriptions of search operations, safety warnings, a summary of the rescue. But what they got, sitting on a weathered bench outside the Furnace Creek station, was something quieter. "I've seen people come into this park full of life," Bill said, his eyes fixed on the distant dunes. "And I've seen people never come back." He spoke of calls coming in, worried families, notes on dashboards, tracks leading nowhere. "You don't realize how big this place is until you try to find someone." He paused, ran a hand over his face. "You think you're just looking for bodies, but you're carrying their stories. All of them. The ones you find, and the ones you don't." Mark and Sarah weren't the first, and they wouldn't be the last. The desert had taken lone hikers, lost travelers, families who had taken a wrong turn and run out of water. "You try not to take it home with you," Bill said, lowering his voice. "But you do." He glanced at the horizon where the sky merged with the earth, blue turning to gold, a line so sharp it almost hurt his eyes. "I love this place," he said quietly. "But sometimes I think it remembers every name we can't." The story quickly went from fact to legend. Around campfires in Death Valley, under a sky split by stars, People began to tell it. The tale of Mark and Sarah, lovers in a sand cave. The details softened, blurred. In some versions, they were newlyweds. In others, newly engaged. Sometimes they were treasure hunters. Sometimes they were dreamers who disappeared into the dunes. The ending was always the same. They went looking for something hidden and were swallowed up by the earth. Visitors asked rangers where it happened, taking pictures at Anvil Canyon, standing by the trails where hunters had once gathered. Guides mentioned it quietly on tours, glancing at the horizon, letting the silence fill in the blanks no one wanted to name. A cave, an X on a map, a final note in a notebook. It all became part of a long, rumbling chain of desert stories. Another chapter, layered on top of the old mining myths, the stories of the Death Valley Germans, the strange echoes people claimed to hear in the night. To the locals, it was less a horror story than a reminder. The desert doesn't need monsters. It has time, distance, heat, silence. That's enough. And in the end, people remember more than just facts. They remember a feeling. The silence that falls when someone says, "Did you hear about the couple who..." And you know that even in the telling, something still hurts. The investigation reports were clear, clinical, almost brutal in their precision. The first was a map cobbled together from printouts, part official trail, part old mining routes found online. It showed paths that no longer existed, roads worn by time and weather, marked by optimism that existed only on paper. The second was timing. They had set out late in the day, when the sun was still hot, but the shadows deceived the eye, making distances seem shorter, slopes surmountable, the way out easy. The third was confidence. Mark's notes spoke of a determined, inquisitive man, eager to go just a little further. Sarah's voice was there too, a gentle caution, but they were a team, trusting each other to turn back in time. But in Death Valley, small mistakes don't stay small. They add up. The avalanche could have come behind them, or above them, or just after they slipped through. A matter of minutes, perhaps even seconds, that turned the survey into a trap. There had been no wild mistakes, no overt acts of recklessness, just the slow, quiet accumulation of bad decisions that, in the desert, is worth everything. The final report ended with a single line, meant to summarize the risk. Environmental factors and human error had combined to create a situation that could not be repaired. But anyone who read between the lines could see that it was saying something simpler. They were human. And here, sometimes that was enough. The plaque had been installed quietly. No ceremony, no speeches, no crowds. Just a few rangers, a small crew, and a simple metal plaque driven into the hard earth near the cave entrance. It read, "In memory of Mark and Sarah, lost July 2001, found October 2009, forever a part of this place." It took days to agree on the wording, how to sum up 8 years of waiting, the weight of family grief, the silence of the searcher's footsteps, the gentle collapse of time itself. In the end, it was succinct, almost parsimonious. The sign was not for tourists or headlines. It was for those who knew, for the families who might someday return, for the rangers who walk this land every day, for the rare traveler who chanced to come close and pause long enough to read. Emily came one day, months later, when the winter sun was low and the desert was cool, quiet. She stood there alone, her hand caressing the metal, her eyes closed. She placed a small stone on top, pale and smooth, the kind you carry in your pocket without knowing why. The cave entrance remained sealed, a scar in the ground, covered with sand and rock. No one had planned to open it. There was no need. The desert had taken what it wanted, and now, at least, it had given enough back. The tablet caught the light at certain angles, shimmering gold, then silver, then soft gray, like a memory too stubborn to fade but too weak to hold entirely. Death Valley had kept most of its secrets after all. For every Mark and Sarah found, there were others whose names still appeared in old missing persons reports. Faces on faded posters, footprints long since swallowed by the dunes. Why do some stories emerge while others remain buried? Perhaps it's chance. Perhaps it's the stubbornness of seekers and half-lucky maps. Perhaps it's time itself. The way the desert changes, loosens its grip, offers a bone, a buckle, a bracelet, a whisper. Or perhaps it's simpler. The desert gives only what it's willing to let go. There's no malice, no hunger, just vastness, heat, time. And in that vastness, people come and go, hoping, testing, wandering, sometimes disappearing. The desert watches, it waits, and in the end, it always wins. Not by violence, not even by cruelty, but by patience. The patience that outlives hope, that wears away stone, that folds names and stories into itself until they are part of the earth, part of the wind, part of the silence. The story of Mark and Sarah ends here, but the story of the desert does not. It continues, as it always has, as it always will. A place where beauty and danger live side by side. A place where some find themselves and others never find themselves. That story was intense, but this story on the right is even crazier.